All right. Welcome, everybody. Before starting, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded. So yes, welcome everybody to this exciting webinar on policy development for ultra-processed foods. My name is Yasmina van Driel, and I'm the Deputy Coordinator of Healthy Diet, Healthy Life, HDHL, which is hosted by ZonMW, the Netherlands Organization for Health Research and Development. And I'm excited and delighted to moderate today's sessions with three amazing renowned speakers looking at the topic from different angles and different perspectives. But first of all, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Jessie Doppler, who's the coordinator of HDHL, to tell everyone a bit more about HDHL and give some background to this webinar. Please, Jessie, the floor is yours.
So much for the introduction, Yasmina. Hello and welcome also from myself on behalf of HDHL. As Yasmina mentioned, I'm the coordinator of HDHL, and I'll be sharing a little bit more information about HDHL and what we do in a very, very brief presentation, because of course we want to mainly focus today on this webinar of developing policy on ultra-processed foods, which Yasmina has already mentioned is a satellite event of the Bioeconomy Changemakers Festival. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this webinar is actually a follow-up of two previous webinars that we have held. The previous webinars were about scientific insights on advantages and disadvantages, research by Dr. Hall about ultra-processed foods that drives overweight and well. We also discussed the NOVA classification by Professor Carlos Montero from the University of Sao Paulo, and also what the role of ultra-processed foods from a health equity perspective would look like. There are so many unanswered questions after this first webinar that we held last June that we decided to organize a second webinar that was held in September, where we led a panel discussion. The full recordings of both of these webinars can be found on YouTube, and we will also put them in the chat. Next slide, please. So today we really want to focus on this Bioeconomy Changemakers Festival. So this third webinar is part of that festival. The Bioeconomy Changemakers Festival is a collaborative initiative between the European Commission, DG Research and Innovation, and the Bioeconomy Youth Ambassadors. It takes place from March 11th to the 17th. And the festival aims to involve youth in driving transformative change for addressing current challenges within Europe and unlocking the bioeconomy's potential as well. So this Bioeconomy Changemakers Festival includes a high-level event in Brussels, which has taken place the last days from the 13th until the 14th. And it's also targeted at bioeconomy stakeholders, policymakers, and interested youth as well. Additionally, over 30 satellite events across Europe will also contribute to this festival, to gathering views for updating the bioeconomy strategy and action plan. And we are one of those events. Next slide, please. So the EU Bioeconomy Youth Ambassadors were selected by the European Commission in 2022 to represent the voice of the youth within the bioeconomy. The Bioeconomy Youth Vision aims to declare their vision on how to shape the bioeconomy concept and upcoming EU and national bioeconomy policies to then align them with the shared mission of tackling climate change and protecting nature as well. So here on this slide, you can see the main priorities of the youth ambassadors. These can, well, they may be an interesting point to start some discussions today on which policies are relevant for ultra-processed foods and the relationship to the bioeconomy as well. So HDHL has provided some input to this youth vision, stressing also the importance of health. And maybe some of you may not be familiar with HDHL, so I'd like to just give a brief presentation also on HDHL and who we are. And for those of you who are familiar, this may just be a quick refresher and reminder as well. If you could move to the next slide, thank you. So HDHL is a joint programming initiative. And for some of you who may not be familiar with what that is, a joint programming initiative is a public-public partnership, and it refers to the cooperation between member states. And this specific joint programming initiative, HDHL, Healthy Diet, Healthy Life, focuses on the societal challenges related to food, nutrition, and health. Slide. So the objective behind HDHL was originally to foster cooperation between member states. And as already mentioned, Healthy Diet, Healthy Life focuses on the societal challenges that are related to food, nutrition, and health. We ensure alignment of national and European strategic research innovation agendas, but also the development and the coordination and promotion thereof. And another point that we really care about that is really high up on our agenda is just knowledge sharing. We really believe that that is key to a lot of the work that we do. We are a member state driven initiative with 18 countries on board. These are mainly European countries, but we also have Canada and Brazil and Israel as part of our initiative as well. I will tell you a little governing structure in a minute, but maybe just briefly to mention at this point that we have a management board that consists of funders and various ministries. We have a scientific advisory board as well as a stakeholder advisory board as well. Over the last 13 years, of which 10 were funded by the EC, and the last 3 now into our 4th year, HDHL has established itself as a valuable interdisciplinary and research and innovation hub that connects scientists and policymakers in the field of nutrition, health, and sustainability. Next slide, please. So briefly on our mission and our members, as already mentioned, we are a member state driven initiative that consisting of 18 countries. And our strategic goal, as you can see here, is that by 2030, all citizens will have the motivation, ability, and opportunity to consume a healthy diet from a variety of foods, have healthy levels of physical activity, and that the incidence of diet-related disease will have decreased significantly. It's quite a big mission. 2030 is around the corner, so we have quite a lot of work ahead of us. Slide, please. Again, briefly on our governance. I think it's relevant for this. Be good for you to know. As mentioned, we have a management board that consists of ministries and parties, but we also have a stakeholders advisory board. Some of the stakeholders on that board, just to name a few, are, for example, WHO, UFIC, DG Santé, IFA, ILSI, but of course there are quite a few others that I won't list now. And we also have a scientific advisory board that the areas of specialty for these researchers also link to the areas that HDHL focus on, which we will see in the next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2019, HDHL published its 3rd strategic research agenda, and as well as the corresponding implementation plan, which has recently been updated and was published in 2022. This outlines the activities of our initiative for the coming 3 years. So you can see here in this figure that the integration between the different areas has been improved in this latest version as well. And as well, very importantly, most importantly for us, is that none of these areas actually stand alone. They all influence each other and they are highly connected. Our strategic research agenda focuses on the 3 areas that are listed here below. As you can see, area 1 is citizens, diet and behavior. Area 2 is food for health, and area 3 is diet, health, and disease. And again, I just time that none of them actually stand act with each. Next slide. I'm aware of the time, so I'll keep it brief. But as mentioned, we're actually now in our 14th year as currently a self-sustaining initiative. And we bring together ministries, funding agencies, and research institutes from the health and food sectors to tackle societal challenges that we feel no country alone can solve. We have a wide range of knowledge, concrete outputs, and practical implications that are used to support policy development in various countries within Europe, but also beyond. We also run our own joint calls. but we also align our work with other JPIs and try to find other synergies also within Europe to be able to explore joint calls. I won't mention and list here all of the things that we have done, but you can see them here on the slide, that we also are very highly involved in some of the partnerships from Era for Health, Future Foods, SFS partnerships, Clever Foods, Fit for Food 2030. So this is something that we're very proud of. So next slide. An infographic. I love infographics. I think they tell the story in a nice way. The graphic was created 4 years ago now, nearly, for our 10-year milestone. I'll just highlight some of the achievements that we're so proud of. So I think most importantly, it's important for us to mention that we have funded over 80 research projects. You can see here also in 2015, HDHL was a part of the Expo in Milan. We had a joint workshop together with FACH JPI in the pavilion of the EC. In 2016, we launched ERA HDHL and HDHL Intimic. And in 2017 was a launch of Fit for Food 2030. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that as well. And by 2020, we had already invested over 110 million into joint activities. So since 2020, we are also a self-sustaining initiative. So I think that this sums up quite nicely some of the work that we have done that we're very proud of. Of course, we're going to continue the journey. Really looking forward to the coming years and to being part of very impactful work here in the European landscape. Maybe last slide. So today, for today's agenda, it will consist of 2 parts. We have from 9 until 11 now the webinar about ultra-processed foods with our guest speakers and policy discussions afterwards. And then from 11 until 12, we will be reflecting on the aims of the Bioeconomy Changemakers Festival. We have a career session, which is primarily for early career researchers, but as well also for people who feel young at heart. It will focus on the science policy interface and how to approach that for researchers. So this could be an interesting session for everybody. So if you're not an early career researcher, please feel free to stay if you're just interested and would like to learn a little bit more about that. But that's it from me. I really hope you enjoy the session today. Thank you all for joining. And I'd like to hand back to Yasmina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, for this introduction, for telling us all a bit more about HDHL. So we will now move on to the next part with our 3 speakers. And I just would like to mention that questions can be asked through the chat, so not through unmuting your microphone, but just through the chat, and we'll make sure that after we have the presentations of the speaker that we will address some of those depending on how much time we have before the working group session. So I'll now introduce the speakers and then give each of them the floor. Our first speaker is Ingeborg Gorme. She's a science policy officer and works for JPI Oceans Initiative, and she coordinates the Blue Bioeconomy ERANET co-fund. She currently manages the food and bio-based portfolio and particularly focusing on partnerships on Horizon Europe and connections to the European Commission. Ingeborg's background is in ecology and population genetics, on-farmed salmon combined with project management and communication experience in Norway and the wider EU. And this uniquely positions her to provide insight into the link between ultra-processed foods and the bioeconomy. So Ingeborg, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, and good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about bioeconomy, food systems, and ultra-processed foods. So as Yasmina just said, my background is I'm a biologist, an ecologist. I think about the big picture and how everything is linked. And the last 4 years, I have been part of coordinating this ERANET on the blue bioeconomy. So thinking about circularity and sustainability together with business and new product development. So For me today is about, are ultra-processed foods bad? They have a bad rep. Do they need to have one? Because from where I'm standing, they might also be part of the solution. So the EU bioeconomy strategy says that the bioeconomy should be part of ensuring food and nutrition security, of course, help mitigate and adapt to climate change. We should use it to reduce our dependence on non-renewable, unsustainable resources. A part of it needs to be about managing our natural resources sustainably, and that also the bioeconomy can help us strengthen European competitiveness and to create jobs. And then in 2022, there was an evaluation, like a progress report on the bioeconomy. How are we doing? And they found that more private investments have been unlocked. Both organic farming and forest growing stock is increasing. There's been an employment increase in many emergent sectors. So, as I mentioned here, pharmaceuticals, bio-based chemicals, other things. And also new technologies for both sustainable and bio-based value chains have been developed and demonstrated. Also, there's been a push in Central and Eastern European countries that have been lagging behind, but there's still a need to focus on better land and biomass management, and to make consumption patterns more sustainable. But this makes me pause because, well, pause. There are, I'm sure many of you know that the jury is still out when it comes to organic farming. We know that it's good for soil health, but it is less efficient and less intensive, which means that we also produce less food per square meter. And I think it's an interesting discussion and interesting thought experiment to think about, is more food on a smaller area or on a bigger area but less intensive better or more sustainable, environmentally sustainable or otherwise sustainable? And also when it comes to forest, it is a bio-based material, so you can use it, but we know that forests capture more carbon if we keep the forest standing. And we also know that a lot of our endangered species in Europe belong in the forest. There's a lot of environmental fragmentation. So is it actually good to log the forest? And then also when it comes to more bio-based materials, it's important to know if they are truly sustainable. There's lack of life cycle assessment standardization, so it is hard to measure and compare the sustainability of products. And it is important that if we make bio-based materials and products, that they are actually better. And then, of course, I think we all know that the food system is an important driver of climate change and biodiversity loss. And it is important to keep in mind as well that when we talk about bioeconomy, when we talk about not just bioeconomy as in food production, but in other materials, that already 49% of the EU surface area is farmed, and that there are more animals in the world that are farmed that are wild. So the food system is definitely an important part of the sustainability and climate change discussion. So about ultra-processed foods and circularity. Exactly, as I said, is gentle use of a large area better or worse than intensive use of a small area? Then of course, more intensive food production is efficient, saves space, but it has severe impacts on biodiversity. While so there's a trade-off there that we need to figure out, and it might not be the same solution for every place. And also, biodiversity is in itself an insurance. So for future food, there might be things we can eat that we haven't found yet. There might be new sources of medicine or materials. But I think also it's important to keep in mind that biodiversity has an intrinsic value in itself. in addition to the ecosystem services that it provides. So a more diverse forest is better for the environment. It reduces, so if you have more species in the forest, there's less risk, there's less dramatic events happening in the forest, but also, of course, diversity actually makes people happy. So to me, I think that when it comes to sustainability, I'm getting back to the ultra processed foods, but when it comes to sustainability, it's about wasting less and using less. So I'm thinking we need to be more sustainable. We need to have more circularity. We need to have less waste. So everything that's waste from one part of a process needs to be used for something else. Because if we used all our waste for something, we would reduce the footprint of the whole food system. And this is where I think ultra processed foods come in, that they are the epitome of circularity. That the ultra processed foods could be an opportunity to use everything. But then the question is, are ultra processed foods intrinsically unhealthy? So this is the question that I want to end up with for my talk. Is there a way that we can make sure that we don't waste anything in our food system, that instead of using materials for animal feed, that we use them for human food? And if ultra processing is the route to go to reduce waste, how can we make sure that the foods that we produce are not unhealthy? With what we know about consumption patterns, how can we make sure that we get healthy processed foods? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingeborg, for providing this perspective on the wider picture of the bioeconomy. I'm sure there will be many questions, but we'll leave them for at the end of this session with the three speakers, so that we know how much time we have. So I would like to move on to Professor Edith Veskens, who is the Chair of Global Nutrition at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And she's actually joining us for this third webinar on ultra-processed foods. And you've joined us before, Edith, to provide your perspective and expertise on this. And she has been an active chair of HDHL Scientific Advisory Board for many years, of which we are very proud and honored. And her current focus is on combating malnutrition globally, with a particular emphasis on low and middle income countries, also considering trade-offs with sustainability. Please, Edith, I would like to give you the floor.
Yes, thanks very much, Jasmina, for the kind introduction. I will share my screen and try to find the right PowerPoint, this one, and I'll put it in presentation mode, slideshow. Yeah, does it work?
It's working, yes. I see your
okay. I hope it's now in the full mode. Yeah, okay. So thanks very much. I'd like to build a little bit on the earlier webinars. So there is also a little bit repetition, but also a look from other angles. So I focus first on the UPF, the ultra processed foods. And I put here a picture of Carlos Montero, because he has put this really widely on the agenda, including his classification, which has been adapted already a little bit. But the aim of food processing itself, of course, is clear. They want to convert raw materials into safe and edible and, let's say, healthy food products. But various means to do that. And then what are then ultra-processed foods? Well, here is the category, and the ultra-processed foods is Nova 4. You can see that here on the right-hand part of the slide. And I think we all recognize from nutrition point of views, the pictures, they really point at foods which are, delicious, but not very healthy. I think that is common sense, and we can also, let's say, underpin this with nutritional research that this is true. Now, the processed foods obviously are also there, not ultra-processed. The difference is probably the extraction and the chemical modification, but there is also, let's say, some confusion, and I'll come back to that later. This one is the confusion, for example. Bread, if you talk about whole grain bread, I had that example earlier. If I make it myself, it's considered as a processed food, but if I buy it in a supermarket, it's an ultra-processed food. Now you can say that it's just semantics, but remember, we do research with this type of information. I'm a nutrition scientist and epidemiologist, so that can already be a source of confusion, but also, I think, for discussion later, that will also confuse the consumer if we want to communicate this to the general public. Now, if I look at the epidemiology, I also have some concerns. So this is a good study, the EPIC cohort study published last year in Lancet. And you see here what we see in most studies: total UPF intake, the intake of ultra-processed food after adjustments, is associated with a higher risk of developing chronic diseases, in this case, cancer and cardiometabolic multimorbidity. So this underpins, let's say, the scare of ultra-processed foods. The problem is a little bit here already below, that if you look at the different types of ultra-processed food, there's clearly a difference. So what I always say, indeed, associations, negative effects of the animal-based products, the processed meats, for example, and the sugar-sweetened beverages, and also the artificially sweetened beverages. But then the other foods, they are not clearly associated with disease risk. So the ultra-processed food intake risk disappears when you adjust for these two. So this means it's a little bit of mixed bag of healthy foods and unhealthy foods. Now, of course, this is epidemiology, be aware. I mean, I'm the first to say we need to be critical, because these are associations, not true causal effects, perhaps. So I think, yes, it's difficult to assess UPF intake, which makes our nutritional epidemiology difficult. But also there are other pitfalls, residual confounding, but also reverse causation. People use artificially sweetened beverages because they want to lose weight. And these are not maybe optimally working, so they keep increasing their unhealthy body weight, and at henceforth increased risk later in life for chronic diseases associated with obesity. So it is not always very clear how to interpret these observational studies. A second issue is the underlying mechanism. And I think low nutritional quality, high fat and sugar, salt, and also low dietary fiber, I think these are the nutritionally, let's say, clear impaired qualities of most of these ultra-processed foods. But there are also suggestions of the impact of contact materials causing obesity and disease, the food additives and other industrial ingredients, contaminants of food processing. But the way I look at the literature, this is hypothesis and not really evidence. And I will be surprised if we ever can prove this evidence. For example, in Europe, the EFSA is doing a very good job in limiting, let's say, and checking the food additives, etc. So I am very skeptical about to what extent these factors really cause these chronic diseases and obesity. I think interesting is this change in food metrics and texture. It will influence the eating rate, and my colleagues are working on that. And it also has something to do with the fiber. And I'd like to show a little bit on this. Well, first, this is the famous study by Kevin Hall. We had him in our webinar, a very good study, but also we can say there are some issues there. He clearly showed that energy intake at libitum was much higher on an ultra-processed diet than an unprocessed diet, and immediately, as of day one, body weight started to increase. At the moment, luckily, there are more RCTs going on because I think it's important to confirm this or even ameliorate the study design. Because what he did, this is real pictures from his supplementary material. This is a lunch at day 2 on the ultra-processed foods. You see this here. Nice and delicious if you like this type of food. And this is the right hand side, the unprocessed, and you can immediately see that it's less convenient to eat, it takes more chewing, it's slower eating. And also be aware that here, to match it in content, in nutrient content, he had to add a fiber to the drinks to make it, let's say, equally in dietary fiber. So there are things which can be improved to say really it's the ultra processing versus the unprocessing, to show really it's the unprocessing which is unhealthy. Now, on the other hand, a PhD student of mine, Marie-Louise Poelman, she looked at, let's say, plant fiber in the whole intact fiber, so in the whole food. And you can imagine that if you have a really processed and purified dietary fiber, you have on your plate the individual molecules, while you have, if you have done it minimally processed, either at home or in a factory, you eat more of the whole cell material. You can say, what does it matter? Well, it matters for your microbiota. In the colon, this is evaluated, or let's say absorbed and affect on the gut microbiota more quickly. This is more in the distal colon because it takes a while before the microbiota and the peristaltic movements are able to break down the plant cell walls. So we can argue that the short-chain fatty acids, which are produced by some of these beneficial bacteria, are produced to more extent in the distal colon, so possibly more with the minimal processed dietary fibers than with the processed and purified fiber extracts. That is one of the hypotheses which ultra-processed foods may be less healthy than the mildly processed food. I switch gears a little bit because also from food processing, I'm not a food processor, by the way, there is interest in mild fractionation, and that has to do also with sustainability. So indeed, if you have mild fractionation instead of extensive fractionation, less water, less energy may be used. Now, there are data on sustainability, and that has been done by people also from our group and the Dutch RIVM, the National Public Health Institute. And they looked at LCAs of ultra-processed food and ultra-processed drinks. And indeed, they showed ultra-processed food and drinks were less healthy, considering high energy, saturated fat, sugar, sodium, but also they were ultra-processed food, had higher greenhouse gas emissions, not very sustainable. On the other hand, less blue water use. Fruit and vegetables, they use a lot of water. Be aware of that. And the food cost obviously were also different, so they were cheaper. And of course, that is also an important reason that why they are so popular for the consumer. Now, on the other hand, of course, we have the food environment, and I understand where the ultra-processed food, let's say, discussion is coming from. For example, Latin America. I think we saw in the news a couple of years ago companies who promote this type of foods in the deep Amazon area, which is something you would not like from a public health point of view. And it has to do with the marketing perspective. Also, I worked in Fiji, only remotely, I must say. This is traditional Fijian food, delicious, it looks nice, but also difficult to prepare. There's a lot of obesity now in Fiji, both in men and women. Only less than 40% have a healthy BMI. And of course, in Fiji, they are very aware of the, let's say, the Coca-Colanization of their economy, introducing the fast food sector. So I can understand where this is coming from. People want to keep their traditional food culture because in theory, when there is sufficient food, it is more healthy. Be aware that also in Netherlands, this is a Finnish study, or in Western Europe, I mean, price value and sensory appeal and convenience are the most important factors for a consumer to select a food. And this is shown everywhere across the globe. You see here, health is only on the 5th place. And we see that always. So that consumer is looking in the shop, looking for convenience, he's looking for the price, he's looking for the sensory appeal. Now, I'd like to close. I have 2 more slides or 3. First of all, I would argue nutrition research is different. I often say we are the lame and the blind. The blind people, they are the RCT people. They cannot see very far, only 3 or 4 weeks ahead, but they can do a lot. And we as epidemiologists, we see a lot. We can see far ahead, 30 years in advance, but we can do very little because we are stuck with what people tell us they have eaten. So our work is difficult. We look for small effects, and our study designs are difficult and never perfect. An RCD is too short, and a food is not a pill, and observational studies are confounded. So my conclusion so far from a food systems angle, I understand that this UPF is developed as a critique on the current food system, at least in the middle income countries. And I understand that. But now, from a nutrition point of view, I see that Nova Food includes healthy products. What to do with that? And I wonder whether the old terms such as junk food are not more valid than what we do now with UPF. And of course, from a food science perspective, mild processing is possible and perhaps more sustainable, but we need more data, as also the previous speaker showed us. What do we do next? I think we need further research, although I'm not only advocating research. We need to develop, evaluate, and implement multi-sectorial interventions for healthy and sustainable diets. And I argue we need to focus at individual foods and food environment. But remember always, who wants to buy and eat foods that are expensive, inconvenient, or do not taste well? Last week, I was also in another, let's say, symposium in Leuven, organized by the EU on the science policy gap. And I was asked what a scientist should do. And I think this is a good start for our discussion later this morning. I think as scientists, we are obliged to bring good data. That is our task. And in addition, we need, with the policymakers and the politicians, a dialogue where we need to be transparent about, whether I have the head of a scientist or I have the head of a worried citizen and let's say a member of a political party, when I engage in discussion with policymakers. And I think this is up for discussion later this morning. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to be involved in this webinar this morning. Thank you. Over to you, Jasmina.
Thank you so much, Edith, for enlightening us and also showing some of the insights from this interesting EPIC study. Before going to the questions, I would now like to introduce our third speaker, Megan Blake, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield, and she specializes in food security and food justice. Her work, supported by a practice-based theoretical approach, involves collaboration with local and national organizations and authorities to achieve impactful research outcomes, enabling real societal change. Megan, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me today. I'm just going to try to share my slides. The little share screen thingy seems to have disappeared.
Should be a green button.
No, it was there and it's gone now.
Okay. Let me see. Maybe if you click on a view in the right-hand top corner, you can exit the full screen, and does it then appear again?
It's appeared. Great, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. Can you all see that? I see my slides.
Yes, we can see them.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you very much. And sorry about my technical inabilities here. I do a lot of work around food insecurity, and particularly in economically wealthy contexts like the United Kingdom, but also Europe and North America. Currently, just to give an example, we often don't think about wealthy countries as having food security issues, but at the household scale, it's a real problem amongst these economically wealthy contexts. In Britain today, 1 in every 4 adults, 25% of adults is food insecure. This despite the fact that the country, or at the national scale, we are a food secure nation. There's plenty of food in the country. It's just that it's not being distributed to everybody who needs it. So much of the work that I do is in collaboration with local community organizations, political parties, food producers and retailers, and charities. And the way in which we get our food, so when we think about households, the way in which we access our food is done so within a neoliberal food context. When I was speaking to a food producer, and one of the things that he described was the ways in which stomach share is a key driver of the economics of food. What the producers want is not just the proportion of your stomach, but they want the proportion of all stomachs when they design and sell food. And one of the ways in which they do this, of course, is to appeal to those values of thrift, values about time constraints, but also taste. And so a lot of the foods that are produced are designed in order to be attractive to us in that particular way. On the other hand, these kinds of foods, ultra-processed foods, or foods that have been modified in this way, are economically sound for those who are selling them. Something that's tinned or preserved lasts much longer on the shelf than can be kept in ambience. It's not subject to cold chain requirements. It can be kept on the shelf for much longer. Whereas fresh food requires additional intervention. It requires things like refrigerators, temperature controls, date labels, and so forth. And one of the items in the supermarket that goes off the very, very quick list is things like fruits and vegetables. So from a retailer's profit perspective, it's much better to have foods that last longer and can linger until they are sold rather than being thrown away. At the same time, within this neoliberal food context, we have seen a withdrawal of services that include community infrastructures, so places where people gather and eat together, and the services that support people to be able to have the food they need for their best lives, and to understand what those foods are. So recently, there's a bit of a furore in England over the ways in which large commercial organizations are providing children's school lunches inadequately, and the food that is being provided fits within these ultra processed food categories. This same company, the head teacher was complaining, and this same company is blaming the reduced quality in food to the higher pressures on profits and the higher pressures or the higher expenses. So using cost of living increases as an excuse for providing cheaper, less good school lunches to children. This same company who's making this argument also saw an increase of profits in the last year in the order of 25% improvement in profit to somewhere around £2 billion. So we can see that there's this kind of the push for profit seeking is a key aspect within the ways that our foodscapes get constructed. Within this neoliberal framing, we also have issues around who is responsible. So much of the rhetoric around people's health and the choices that they make is somehow this idea that people have unfettered choice. When they walk into the supermarket, they have free choice to choose everything from within that space. And the fact of the matter is that people's choice sets are narrowed down by their circumstances, by what's available in the places where they live, by the resources that they have available to them. And that includes things like their cooking skills and food knowledges, time, their mental state, their physical situation or physical state, what sorts of technology that is available to them. So all these sorts of things, and then of course money and finance determines what and how you can buy things at the supermarket. So that our choice individually, our choice set is not the whole of what's available in the supermarket, but a much more narrowed version of that that's linked to our own situation. And of course, the solutions are often on self-organizing or self-individualized responsibility for addressing or for the choices that we make. what I want to argue is actually the foodscapes play a really important role in determining the choice sets that people have. Foodscapes are the spaces and places where activities related to the production, procurement, preparation, and consumption of food occur. They're also the places where people get meaning from and learn about food. So food is more than just nutrients, calories, and profit. Food is also in communities is it's commensal, it's a connecting element. It's something that inspires memory and well-being, or it can create stress and unhappiness. Foodscapes are shaped by physical processes and attributes. So, what's physically the material elements within that space, but also things like policies, discourses, values, and social practices, what we do and how we do it. And how these things are coordinated and organized makes a very big difference to how the outcomes that they produce. Foodscapes are the material spaces through which food practices are enabled and constrained. And they also mediate our relationships with food. So foodscapes can help us to have a good relationship with the food that we have so that we can live our best life. But they also can produce situations whereby our food is scarce, or whereby our choices are limited, or whereby our relationships with food are negative. So we can argue then that when we think about all of these things, foodscapes are produced geographical contexts within which we source the food that we eat. And that's what economists refer to as a two-sided platform problem. Some foodscapes are better than others. And one of the things we see is that in places where people are struggling financially, they also tend to concentrate in places. So there's more financial struggle. It's not evenly distributed across this landscape. It's concentrated in particular neighborhoods and areas. So on the one hand, we have food producers and retailers seeking profit and making rational profit-making decisions about what to include on the shelves and whether to provide shelves in the first instance, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have issues around household decision-making. So, of course, there's the issue around affordability. There are issues around risk aversion. People don't want to try new things if it's going to waste their limited household resources. So diets become narrower and narrower. There are limits as diets become narrower, and that interacts with what commercial food systems are doing. Particular food items disappear from particular landscapes. We also have, and as that disappears, we also see a disappearance in terms of people's food knowledges. So when we go into schools, one of the things we hear is children who don't know what grapes are, and people who have never had a parsnip and don't know what it is. And, at one point we were complaining or alarmed by the fact that children didn't know where food came from. And now what we're seeing increasingly is children don't even know what certain foods are that we had previously known or taken for granted. And of course, this kind of narrowing and focusing of our foodscapes leads to these poor relationships and poor health within these spaces. So we know that in places where people are struggling to get the food that they need to live their best life, they're also facing diet-related poor health from the foods that they are eating. So one of the issues then is, how do we address this problem? And I want to provide, firstly, from a policy perspective, two examples of policy that is being implemented that aren't particularly good examples of what to do. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with a couple of other examples. So the first is just telling people to eat better food. If we educate them, somehow people will change their behaviors. What we see instead, though, is that people feel stigmatized, they feel anxiety, and a lot of the change doesn't happen because nothing has changed within the context within which people live. Their choice sets still remain the choice sets that they had before. They just have more guilt about them. The second approach is a little bit more complicated, and it does seek to change the environments. And this is concerned with increasing use of planning to remove the presence of takeaways or fast food chains from within the proximity of schools. And interestingly enough, within planning regulations, a McDonald's is not classified as a takeaway outlet because there's seating. It's a cafe, and so it doesn't actually fit within the planning regulations of what they're trying to ban. So you could have a McDonald's or another one of those kind of fast food takeaways right next to the school, but you can't have the smaller scale locally owned fish and chip shop or other sorts of more ethnic or non-traditional British foods that often appear in these kinds of shops. So what happens is that this focus on the delivery mechanism rather than on the food itself that's being delivered through a takeaway option has some inequalities that are built into it. It removes social environments for lower income people. It's working or providing these kinds of employment opportunities is a livelihood strategy for certain groups of people who have been excluded from the labor market elsewhere. So it ends up creating other problems for people, and again, doesn't necessarily solve the problem. There's mixed evidence about that. So in order to address diet-related poor health in a socially just way, we need to take a systems view that focuses on supply and demand and on the various actors within that context that surround and shape both of those things, as well as the foodscape itself. We need to consider the practices and assets and motivations of all those people, all the stakeholders who are involved. So I want to just turn in my quick conclusion here to the remaining, to just very quickly, two projects where we're seeking to change the foodscapes for people who in communities that are struggling. Both are place-based interactions, and as a result of that, they have a reduced stigma compared to interventions that have barriers to participation. One is a low-cost food club. It uses surplus food alongside some purchased food to provide bags of groceries to communities. 3 bags of groceries, always with one that is a bag of fruits and vegetables, one that is a ambient food, and one that's chilled food, so salads and meats and things like that. So there's always fruits and veg included. And what we see from this, so the food clubs meet once a week. People come, they pay a small amount of money, and they get 3 bags of groceries. What this allows them to do is see thrift. So they calculate that they're saving on average about 26 pounds per week. People tell us that they're eating more fruits and vegetables as a result, because there's actually fruits and vegetables in the spaces where they live. For many of these communities, the fruit and veg section of the local shop has disappeared or is shrunk down to a few carrots and maybe an onion and a couple of potatoes. People tell us that because they're getting access to this food, they're cooking better food at home, and they're also able to try new foods because surplus food throws up or creates opportunities to engage with foods that people would not be able to or could not choose to purchase. And it's more acceptable than food banks. There are also social benefits. People are meeting their neighbors. There's reduced social isolation, and there's reduced fear of crime and fear of neighbors. And then, of course, people are also volunteering. So there's a whole host of things that are rebuilding not just the food, but using food as a way to rebuild community social economies in this project or in this approach. The second project is one called Fresh Street, which is a fruit and veg voucher scheme. What happens with this is people are given £5 worth of vouchers a week. They can be spent at local fruit and veg vendors. What we've seen is that some of the vendors have created mobile, so in a local market stall, they pop up sort of shops where they go into neighborhoods that are food deserts or places where there isn't food, and sell the product out of the van. What's of benefit through the voucher scheme is that there's change in the retail environment. So it creates a consistent and reliable weekly demand for fruits and vegetables for retailers, so they can continue to stay in business and they can expand to include new products for people and into new areas, such as through the mobile version. There are changes in households as a result. The vouchers prompt action to purchase fruits and vegetables. They did reduce the risk associated with wasting household resources, and it saves money. And of course, it's done changing diets. So people talk about being healthy. They talk about also those social interactions that result in shopping together and being part of this scheme. So there are ways which we can intervene and change foodscapes in a more systemic way that enable people to make different kinds of choices, and choices that are healthier for them. And I will conclude there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Megan, for showing us how food environments, foodscapes, how they influence people, but also how we can actively change them. I see that we have 5 minutes for some questions, so I'm just quickly going through the chat. I think most of the questions have been answered, but there is a question, or rather a comment for Ingeborg. Using the natural additives such as natural color and natural preservative, natural antioxidants, and bring functional foods to the processed foods. Is that something you can comment on, Ingeborg?
I'm not sure if there's a question, a proper response, but of course there's a lot of natural additives that are being developed that we find from alternative resources, which I think is excellent. But still, we need to look at the true sustainability of using new bioresources, I think. But there are a lot of opportunities. And for instance, in my Eranet, we have funded a research project that looks into extracting the red color from a red algae. Instead of, now it's quite, you use, I was going to say an insect, I think it's a, yeah, at least I think it's a spider or a midget or something that we use instead. And so extracting the red color from an algae is both a vegan and, suits many more diets, you could say. But then we need to figure out how to sustainably farm the algae, or to harvest it in a good way.
Okay, thank you. And maybe just
you,
very,
Ingeborg,
sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Because what I always find difficult in LCAs is the impact on biodiversity.
Exactly.
I mean, as I showed, right, the mild processing, you can calculate the energy use, and you can calculate the water use, and also a little bit further upstream in the chain or in the food system. But for the biodiversity impact, I think it's much more difficult to quantify. Or am I mistaken?
So no, you're not mistaken. I think part of the issue is that when it comes to life cycle assessment, which is the best way we have of quantifying the environmental impact or the sustainability of a product, it's not yet, there's no agreement on how exactly to calculate it, how much to take into account. Even if you start with the product and you calculate all the way down, how do you calculate the consequences? And so in some of our funded projects, they have calculated, for instance, the LCA of a new feed ingredient for fish farming, and they found that it's 40% more sustainable than the current ingredients. But then there's also, but it's hard then to, when you have a more of a complex meal, for instance, how do you calculate LCA for every single thing that you're eating, right? But I think that, I mean, the sustainability aspect is, when it comes to ultra processed foods, is more about using less resources from the start, right? That, so I work in Blue. I saw that there was a question in the chat that, so if you have a fish, so I work with the ocean, and the fillet of a fish is only a third of the volume of the fish. We have 2/3 left of the fish, and to use the whole fish. So now most of the fish cutoffs are used for fish animal feed, not just for fish, but for cows and pigs. But to follow the food first principle, we would want more of the animals that we produce to become human food. But at least even in Norway, we don't really eat fish heads anymore. And so we used to. And we used to make shoes out of fish skin, but we don't anymore. And so, like, how do we eat the rest of the fish? And I think that processing the heads and the skins and everything into something that can then become emulsifier, become fish soup, but then you need to sell it as like ready soup in a bag, right?
Yeah.
And then it's suddenly at least somewhere in the ultra processed or processed foods.
Yeah.
So how can we do circularity and do it healthy?
Yeah.
I think that's a great example also for going into discussions later. I just wanted to close this sort of the discussion before we go into the working groups with a last question for the panel, for all three of you. And maybe you can just reflect very shortly on it. It's a question about food labeling. If you feel that it should show that processing should be included, or should we stick with the current food labeling advice? So this also touches, I guess, food environment and focusing on the individual. So maybe Megan, would you like to start with a short reflection on that?
It's an interesting idea, and certainly that people are exploring things like stoplights and so forth, but people tend to eat things together rather than just individually, and it's confusing for people. People also, at least when I talk to people, they eat food relationally, so they think about, is this better than that? So the frozen pizza is better for them than the micro burger might be. At least that's in their mind. I think labeling kind of works initially, but then it stops working, and creates further confusion. So I'm not so sure about that. When we talk to people, they know what's better for them and what's not. So that's just kind of my view.
Thank you. And Edith, could you reflect on that?
Yeah, I have the same concerns. A food can never be healthy or unhealthy, right? I'm a nutrition scientist, and like toxicology, it's always in the dose, and in our terms, it's always in the combination. On the other hand, if you want to transmit some advice, like we have in the Netherlands, the Wheel of Five, or in other countries, right? Dietary guidelines, food pyramids. How do you convey those messages best? Well, food labeling can help, and some of them have been shown to affect at least awareness, or sometimes also modified or stimulated the producers to make the product a little bit more healthy. So that is also sometimes a beneficial side effect, or maybe an intended effect of food labeling. We now currently have the Nutri-Score. It doesn't completely agree with our dietary recommendations, so that can be confusing. So let's see what happens in our country later in a couple of years if the consumers got confused. There is now the idea that the Nutri-Score could have a black band around it when the food would be ultra-processed. I'm not so much in favor of that. Like I said, the ultra-processed category and the processed category are too confusing. I think we should come up then with a better classification, and I wonder whether that's really needed based on the things we have in terms of Nutri-Score or algorithms. It's never going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't like, again, my favorite whole grain bread in the supermarket to be disstimulated. I wouldn't like to see that. But of course, that's just an anecdotal evidence, but no.
Yeah, very clear. Ingeborg, very quickly reflection on this, and then we go to the groups.
I'm also unsure when it comes to labeling. I think there might be a need for sustainability labeling when we talk about life cycle assessment, or sort of, has this product been sustainable all through the value chain, for instance, using MSC. So for fish, there's some aquaculture and fisheries, there's a label, MSC or ASC, they can use for like, this is a sustainably harvested product, and that could be true for used for other land-based products as well. But we have those already, I think, with fair trade or other things. I think for me, it's like, people still don't actually eat 5 vegetables or fruit a day, right? It's like the simplest thing that everybody knows. We've been talking about it for so long, and still people don't do it. So I think like the most sustainable and also healthy thing we could do is eating 5 vegetables a day. Start there. And then I really believe in more financial incentives for consumers. I think it's a little annoying that it's only communication campaigns for consumers, and not just like tax incentives or financial incentives. Why not just make it cheaper? I don't understand that part, but I'm just a biologist, so maybe Megan knows.
Thank you for bringing that in. Also linked to the true cost pricing of food. But we have to go now into our working groups, which I think is very a unique part of this webinar. We'll actually now have 2 working groups so that we can dive a bit more in depth. So I'm asking all participants to stay on for this part, and of course also for the early career part after that. There will be 2 groups. And the objective is actually to think within your group and discuss about well, what you've just heard, and how this reflects on your thoughts on developing policy on ultra processed foods. Should there be certain policies or not? What should be done in this respect, or what's your perspective on this? And also, of course, we really want to leverage the expertise of everyone here, also young people, and those, like my colleague said, who feel young at heart. So please stay on for this interactive session. I also want to ask everyone to take out or have their phones ready, because we'll also have some Mentimeter questions in the breakout rooms. So I will now like to ask my colleagues to put us all in 2 breakout rooms, and that will then magically happen through Zoom. So I think it should be okay. Welcome back, everybody. And I hope you've had interesting and dynamic discussions in your group. We certainly have had very interesting discussions. So for this last part, before we go into a short break before the early career network session, I would like to give the other group, I think that was Edith and Ingeborg, the floor to give us a reflection on, yeah, the discussions in your group and the vision for the future.
Well, I can start and then Ingeborg can follow. I think we had a very nice discussion and we tried to make it a little bit broader than only Ingeborg and me, which we really succeeded also. And I think um, in the end, we kept a doubt on ultra-processed food. And I think it's the name, which is not apt for basing policy on. That is my quick summary. And also we thought about, convenience is an important issue for many people, even around the globe. So cooking from scratch is difficult to realize in many, many situations. But how can we help people to make the right choices? Or, so it's not only to educate them better, but also provide them tools and recipes. And obviously also to change the food environment. This goes hand in hand. And we talked about, let's say, regulatory measurements like taxes or making fruits and vegetables cheaper, which even in the Netherlands we didn't succeed yet. So that is very awkward. And also we talked about food labeling, in which we were a little bit mixed. And overall, we thought it will not be helpful to label the ultra-processed food separately. On the other hand, it's also good to look at other examples, like in Chile, to see what we can learn from them and see whether we need to adapt something in our food system.
You
Ingeborg?
can say that in a way, it's a simple problem that has a very complex solution. That's why it works so well. That
Yeah.
Of course, that you have both healthy and unhealthy processed foods, but it's difficult then to communicate this complexity to consumers and I think to policymakers. And I think especially when we think about policy, then how do you differentiate? As the McDonald's example, it's a cafe, it's not a fast food place. So how do you differentiate these things? How do you talk about texture and nutritional value when you talk about ultra processed foods? Is it possible to improve it, or do we need to help consumers to consume something else? But also, I think an important thing that we mentioned was about how these chemicals are not dangerous in themselves, and that they also are important for texture. They're an important component of the food itself. So it's not obvious how you can make changes.
Thank you for those reflections. So yeah, I understand there were some lively discussions, and I'm sure we can continue for a long time, but I would like to now move to the other group. Megan, I was in that group with you, and we also had interesting discussions talking about the role of education or the role of regulatory measures and food environment. So please, if you can reflect.
Well, I think what was particularly nice, I thought, was the discussion about taking a systems view and ensuring that we incentivize and prioritize those with the less with lesser power, and recognize the skills and knowledges that they bring to the table. So, the one point that was made is that we must regulate industry if we want to reduce if we want to shape that, because they are going to just do what will make them profits. There is a need to also recognize that we need to change and shape and coordinate the systems in which people are engaging with and getting their food. We talked a little bit about public education, and that was an interesting discussion. I think in the poll that came out as one of the top kind of approaches, but in the discussion, there were several people in the room who talked about where this is problematic because it's individualizing, and it takes a really long time for any sort of public education campaign to work, if it even does. So, for example, wearing your seatbelt was an example of a behavioral change education intervention, and it wasn't until, and people will talk about the health, the safety issues around that with the visuals, but actually it's when wearing your seatbelt in your car was made a legal requirement that people start wearing their seatbelts in their cars. So these kind of legal framings are important. And did you have something else that maybe I missed? I wasn't taking notes, so it's relying on memory.
Yeah, so it was a lively discussion, and there's a lot of food for thought there. And I think the discussion is nowhere final yet, or we haven't really reached complete consensus on this topic. But I think there's a lot of interesting ideas that have been shared, and also some interesting examples, which are also always good for this kind of topic. And as HDHL, we're very passionate about this topic. So also in the future, we are looking forward to bring this further and also sharing some of the insights that have been brought to the webinar today with a wider audience. So for now, I would really like to thank everyone for participating in this part of the session. And I also want to mention that we've been joined by Enrico Barsch from the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And he will be in the session after the break that focuses more on sort of early career and research to policy. How do you bring research insights, outcomes to the policy domain? How do you share that knowledge? What are sort of the mechanisms? And first, we'll take a little break for that. But before we do that, I really want to thank the three speakers, Ingeborg Korme from JPI Oceans, Edith Veskens from the University of Wageningen, and also Megan Blake from the Sheffield University for your insights and sharing your expertise and your thoughts on this interesting and diverse topic. So now I want to go into the break, so you can just turn off maybe your camera, and then you come back at 11 when we will continue the early career session.